I'm John Reeks. I play clarinet, bass clarinet, and saxophones in the orchestra. I'm also the president of the orchestra this year. I am the only person in the orchestra who was born and raised and educated in New Orleans, and I've been here all my life. And I was in the old orchestra that was in place before the LPO. And so this is, I think, my 42nd year of playing music professionally in New Orleans. I wouldn't trade my experience in the LPO for anything. I always look at it as my third child, so I take that sort of pride of ownership and also of accomplishment in raising this child from where it started 25 years ago. One of the things that the musicians who put the orchestra together in those days felt was really important is that there has to be classical music in New Orleans. And that certainly was important for me when I was growing up, that I would go to classical concerts, that my teachers were in the orchestra, and I'm so glad that we can keep that alive. So as a New Orleans native, I take a special interest and pride in keeping this organization going and happiness in its success. Well, like everything else in New Orleans, there's before the storm and after the storm. It's almost like BC and AD for people who live here. And of course, before the storm, the LPO had been in existence for about 15 years. And we were going through growing pains and different things were happening as far as the development of the orchestra, but we were on a fairly steady keel. And then the storm hit, and everyone in the orchestra was dispersed all over the country. It was a very confusing time, but I felt like the orchestra has always been my extended family, and we acted together again at that time. After the storm, we communicated with each other really soon after and said, what are we going to do to make sure that this is still going on? We figured that we had lost not only our homes, but our home, the Orpheum, and we started putting things together. That sense of togetherness, of family, of camaraderie was so strong in the orchestra, more so than my church, more so than a lot of other organizations in New Orleans. And I think the reason that happened is because of our organization, because of the way that we came together after the first storm hit, when the old orchestra went out of business, and it hit us like a storm. It was such a surprise, and we had to regroup. We had to build from scratch. We had to put an orchestra together and a business together. And so there were still so many people left from those days that we were able to do that again really successfully after Katrina. Right before the storm, I actually wasn't here. Stephanie, my wife, and I were up visiting her parents in Ohio. And we started seeing the news reports, oh, there's a storm coming, and looks really serious. And I just poo-pooed the whole thing. You know, as a New Orleans native, I've been through so many storms, and so often they don't live up to their hype. And it started looking more serious and more serious. So I caught actually what happened to be the last plane back into New Orleans to pick up our cats who were still in the house, and some of our instruments that we hadn't taken with us, some of our instruments that we used for the orchestra. And so I put them in the car, and I said, okay, I'll drive. I'll take that back. I wasn't going to go. I was still in the house on the Saturday before the storm hit on Sunday night. Because I said, this is baloney. I've been through so many storms, you know, I might lose power for a couple hours, you know, I'm just going to ride it out. But the news reports kept getting worse and worse, and my friend said, get out. And Stephanie said, you got to come back. So I said, okay, I'll drive up to maybe right out of town, drive to Shreveport for a day or two and have a nice vacation, and then come back to New Orleans. Stephanie will come back. But everything was so crowded, and there was no hotels, any place to stay. So I decided to just keep going straight back to Ohio to stay with Stephanie's parents. We ended up staying there for about 3 or 4 months. The first thing that happened after the storm for us, we regrouped almost immediately and found out who was available and where everybody was. Of course, they all dispersed to all parts of the country. And it was a very moving experience when we did get back together. Some of us didn't know if if others were even alive. And when we got back together, I remember there was a moment when the Nashville Symphony put together a benefit concert, a side by side for us and for our benefit. And we all met in Nashville, and didn't know who was going to be there, how many people were going to be there, if we could fill out sections. But we all met together in a hotel ballroom for a lunch, and it was very moving. After our successful Nashville concert, the New York Philharmonic did something very similar for us to benefit. In fact, it was on a much bigger level. It was on national radio. It was a radiothon fundraiser. Great artists from all sorts of genres came forth to help us and to be on the concert with us. Like Randy Newman, he of course did the Louisiana 1927 song with us, and he re-recorded it to be put on a new benefit CD that we saw benefits from. And it was a great experience. To me, the nicest and one of the stranger things was that the musicians local in New York City, Local 802, which is a huge union, came forth with funding for us to be there, and paid for our hotel and some other funding for that. And that's our brothers at work, so it was a really cool thing. And that was also a great event. A couple of months after that, the much smaller orchestra in San Luis Obispo, California, did a side-by-side. And so everybody who could flew to California and did a concert there. So it was amazing, you could say, from coast to coast, that the outpouring of help for us was overwhelming. The first time we came back to see our house is in November, when the LPO got together for a Christmas concert, I think it was, and this, of course, the city and our house and everything was still pretty much devastated at that time, and it was very strange to come back to this alien planet that I used to call home and that I loved. We're sitting on the front porch of the house that Stephanie and I bought a couple of months before the storm hit. We had renovated this house totally. It was beautiful, and then the storm hit and wiped everything out. We lost everything that we owned, and so we worked really hard to get our house back together, and here it is. I think it turned out really well. Stephanie and I are so happy living here, but as you see from these other pictures, it was a mess. That everything we owned was ended up in the front yard. It was really heartbreaking to see our whole lives strewn across our front yard. We of course painted over our Katrina tattoo that was on the front porch here, but we kept this as a memorial. This is how high the water was in our house, and of course it swirled around like a washing machine during the storm, and then it sat like a gumbo for about 2 weeks, and so that's why everything we owned, if it hadn't been damaged by the storm and the flooding itself, the mildew took over the whole house pretty much from that water sitting here. When we did come back to New Orleans to rebuild our house and our lives, we had no place to stay. We had some problems with a FEMA trailer with bureaucracy, and we couldn't live there. So again, we got help from our dear friend Judith, who plays violin in the orchestra, of course. And she allowed us to stay in her house for the months that we were renovating and rebuilding our house. And then we finally moved back in, and it was a great experience. So I certainly don't feel bitter about what happened. I feel really, first off, we lost everything, but it was just stuff. It wasn't each other, and it wasn't intrinsic things. It was just stuff that could be replaced. And you could look at that as a cleansing, a purge. But mostly I learned about people, that especially strangers, and I hope that it's helped me treat people a little nicer since that time.